He was still when they first noticed him, a small lion cub folded against the outer fence, ribs set like slender branches under thin fur. He did not call. Heat pressed into the yard and made the metal staples click softly, and the cub let the sounds pass without turning his head. The noon lull held the camp in a loose hush. A guide spoke quietly about hippo paths by the bend, his words trailing off when a child's finger lifted toward the fence. The shape by the posts did not belong to human edges. It belonged to grass and shade and the low hollows where wind sleeps. A ranger stepped from the veranda and paused, as if the ground itself had asked for permission. He angled away, kept his shoulders small, and moved with an old patience. Up close, he saw burrs clinging to the haunches and a raw place along the jaw where skin had rubbed thin. The mouth opened once, made no sound, and closed again. He brought a shallow basin and a jug and set them on the camp side of the fence. Water trembled into a thin circle that held the sky. The ranger stepped back until only the low bowl and the quiet remained near the cub. Tourists watched, as if learning a new way to be still. The cub's paws lay like pale leaves, the pads dry and cracked. When a gust carried the faint dampness toward him, his nose twitched. His eyes, dull with effort, shifted to the basin and back to the wood, as if the fence were a thing that might decide. He gathered his forepaws under his chest and pushed a little. The hips failed to rise, and so he slid forward, belly to dust. Whiskers brushed the groove in the earth where the wire's shadow ran. He halted, then inched again, until his whiskers touched the damp cloth the ranger had draped over the rim. "Easy, little one," the guide murmured, his voice no louder than the canvas sighing in the shade. The cub's tongue touched his own nose and left a wet line. He leaned his chin to the wood, paused as though the act of choosing were work, and then lowered his mouth to drink. Water wicked upward, and he drank. The sound was small and uneven, like rain that cannot decide. He did not lift his gaze. Jaw muscles worked in a careful rhythm, more endurance than appetite, and his ribs moved in the slow count of a body, spending as little as possible. When he stopped, he rested with the cloth beneath his jaw and let a thin stream run into the fur at his throat. "Help!" here began with distance. The rangers did not reach through wire or hurry. They watched the grass beyond the yard for shapes that did not belong to afternoon, held their bodies quiet, and softened the scene until the cub owned it. One shaded the basin while the sun crossed the opening and withdrew. Another asked the guests to sit so there would be fewer standing horizons. Minutes stretched and lost their corners. The cub tried to stand again and managed less than he had before, then more than he had hoped. Knees gathered, forequarters lifted, and the small spine learned a new bend that did not ask the hips to rise. He crept the distance of a tail's breadth and stopped with his nose above the water, breathing it in as if scent itself were food. A thin cloud crossed the sun and laid a shallow shade on the cub's back. He drank again and swallowed with less effort. After a while, he licked his paw and smoothed a burr from his shoulder with deliberate care. The camp manager arrived without rush and took her place among the watching, eyes on the rangers before the cub. Years of mornings had taught her the shape of these choices. She waited until the ranger gave the smallest nod, then called the wildlife team and spoke the facts with spare clarity. A young male, severely underweight, responsive to water, non-vocal, location safe for approach. "Almost there," the ranger whispered, when the cub shifted his weight and found a way to tuck both paws beneath him. He kept his hand low and open, the gesture more promise than offering. The cub's tail lifted a finger's width and fell. He turned his head a little and listened to the space behind him, as if checking whether the plane had followed him to the fence. Nothing pressed. It would have been simple to close distance and tip the basin nearer. But simplicity often belongs to the wrong story. They kept the space honest. The fence marked a respectful line. People here, wild there, and care allowed to pass between. The cub tested his forepaws, pushed a slow inch, and brought his chest fully into the post's shadow. Beyond the trees, a vehicle eased to a stop and cut its engine. Two figures stepped out and did not advance. They measured the seen and the unseen, the angle of the wind, the possibility of other eyes just beyond the grass. The cub's ears turned and then returned. He lay as he was, present, tired, alive within the thin shelter of a boundary he had chosen. Shade broke and returned as clouds rearranged themselves. The cub raised his head and drank for the third time, longer now, pausing only to breathe. When he finished, he rested his muzzle on his foreleg and blinked as if the lids were cooler than the air. Damp darkened his fur and then lifted away. His chest rose and fell without the earlier hitch. The rangers spoke with the team beyond the trees, agreeing on patience, on steps that bothered no one. They would wait for steadier breath, for that small gathering of will that arrives when a body has tasted relief. If the cub tried to leave, they would let him, following at a distance. If he chose to stay, they would work from the outside, inward, touch, last. Wind shifted and brought the mineral smell of the river. The cub lifted his head to it, not in wonder, but in habit. Afternoon unspooled so slowly that time felt like water, weightless until you tried to hold it. He turned his face to the post and leaned the thin arc of his neck against it, taking from the wood a steadiness the ground could not give. The rangers offered water and shade and the quiet that can carry a creature across an hour. They waited for his body to decide what it could do next. By the time the sun leaned toward late afternoon, the cub's breaths had found a rhythm that did not betray him. He tucked his paws more neatly under his chest, lifted his head on his own, and watched the opening between two posts as if the day lived there. The yard did not applaud, it simply held. When the figures at the tree line shifted their weight, the cub noticed and did not tense. The fence had become, for the moment, both barrier and comfort. He licked the cloth once more and, without effort, drew water. The longer swallow was the first true sign that the next hour might belong to something gentler than the last. The ranger let out a breath he had kept measured and did not move closer. Shadows lengthened by the inch. The cub placed his chin on his foreleg, ears turned toward wind, and watched dust lift and settle in small dances that asked nothing of him. He had come to the only human line in a long distance and found it willing to hold still. When the team finally raised a hand in greeting from the trees, no one answered with motion. The yard remained a place of waiting and breath. Evening would come, and with it, decisions. For now, the cub lay inside the fine crossing of fence shadow, damp jaw drying, chest steady, tail a quiet line behind him. The plane exhaled, the camp answered, and the hour rested on both like a cloth. Whatever had driven him from grass to post could wait at the edge of light. Here, for a little while, there was only water, shade, and time enough to try again. They kept their distance because distance was the only honest kindness left to offer. By late afternoon, the fence threw a longer shadow over the dust where the cub had settled. He didn't try to rise when the rangers returned with fresh water. He only lifted his eyes and followed the bowl. The basin was set where the shadow cooled the wood, and the team stepped back, careful and empty-handed. He was smaller than he should have been for the season. Even across the line they saw the ridge of spine and the hollows where muscle should have rounded the hips. A patch along the flank showed skin rubbed nearly bare. He breathed in a shallow rhythm that counted energy like coins, saving what little remained for the next swallow and the next blink. They had seen hunger before, but this was hunger mixed with a long absence of touch. Not the kind given by people, but the kind that comes from a mother's mouth, finding burrs and ticks and licking them away. The cub's ears showed crusted edges. His tail had lost the loose curve that belongs to safety. When wind shifted, he turned his head a fraction toward the scent, then let it go. The camp quieted. Near the gate, a ranger tied a strip of cloth to a pole and raised a square of shade where the fence's shadow fell short. He fixed it so it wouldn't flap and stepped away. They left a shallow dish of water and beside it a smaller cup holding a mixture that smelled faintly of salt and honey. It was a rehydration solution, not sweet enough to insist, kind to a stomach that had gone still. They had learned to avoid sudden gifts, too much, too fast, and the body turns every kindness away. The cub sniffed once, breathed out, and kept his jaw on his foreleg. Beyond the yard the plain continued. The wildlife team remained near the trees, speaking into radios with words that named common risks: mange, ticks, worms, dehydration, separation. The list was a map of everything the cub had endured and somehow outlived long enough to reach the fence. They looked for signs of pride nearby, but saw only the scribble of guinea fowl and the neat commas of small antelope. Whatever had broken the path had not left him near those who might mend it. Absence weighed more than heat. A bottlefly worried the raw spot by his jaw. He twitched the skin there and missed. His whiskers were bent, frayed at their ends. When he shifted, he did it with calculation, keeping his belly low, feet sliding rather than lifting. A healthy cub would have tested the post or flicked his tail at flies. This one economized even his curiosity. The rangers measured every small change. They marked the time between drinks and the length of each swallow. They watched how his ribs moved, whether the pull beneath them deepened with thirst or eased with shade. Notes went back to the team without adornment, non-vocal, responsive to scent, minimal startle. The manager returned with a crate and placed it inside the gate. Gauze, gloves, iodine, syringes for fluids if permission came, and a folded towel. Nothing would cross the fence until the plan was agreed. As the light changed, the cub drifted toward the cloth shade in a slow arc, the way a boat slides when someone touches it with one finger. When he reached the cooler dust, he rested again. The solution's scent rose, salt and faintly sweet. His nostrils moved, tested it, then stilled. The pause said he understood water now, but food was a later thing. He kept his eyes on the open space beyond the posts instead of on the cup. A jackal barked far off. The cub did not answer or tilt an ear. He blinked, and that effort showed a line of crust along the lids. On his shoulder, 3 ticks had reached the size of dull beads. Patience became the labor of the hour. The team set a slow pattern. No one would stand directly before the cub for more than a minute. All movements would happen at the edges of his sight. If he shifted away, they would leave the space he chose untouched. In their experience, animals often read intention before action. Stillness was a language that meant stay or go. Both are allowed. The river sent a cool ribbon of air along the fence, and the cub angled his face into it. A ranger dipped a folded cloth into the rehydration cup and laid it over the rim so drops would wick to the outer edge. He eased back, hands open. The liquid beaded and fell without sound. The cub watched, the yellow of his eyes dim but steady. He did not lick. He did not turn away. One of the younger rangers lowered his height below the post tops. The manager's look held him there. They were not making themselves smaller to trick him. They were trying to make the horizon simple enough that a young, tired brain could hold it without fear. The difference was thin as thread, but everything. "Slow steps," the manager said. The cub lifted his head and opened his mouth as if to call. Air crossed his tongue and left without sound. Perhaps his throat had forgotten the way. Perhaps he had learned that voice spent strength with no one to hear. He lowered his head and let his jaw rest where dust had polished the bone. Shadows stretched into evening. When the sun touched the far ridge, a thin coolness came up from the ground. The cub shivered once, a tremor that began at the ribs and travelled outward to the paws. The rangers saw it and noted it. One fetched a second cloth and set it nearer the post, another small piece of shade. They made the place gentler without making it more human. At the tree line, the wildlife vet lifted a hand in greeting, then returned to the shade. They had agreed, no capture, no net, no sudden kindness, not yet. The body needed to choose the next step. Even a good plan could become a harm if it arrived before willingness. They took comfort in the order of the process. Observe, offer, wait, observe again. A hyena called from beyond the kopje. The fence was stout, but not absolute. The rangers checked the perimeter and found no gaps. They considered the hours ahead, how to keep the yards quiet while not leaving the cub alone to the dark. A rotation was set without orders. No one said they would stay. They simply remained. His breathing grew deeper as the air cooled. He rolled a shoulder an inch to rub at the raw place by his jaw, then stopped when pain rose and settled. The dullness in his gaze shifted toward a steadier watchfulness. No spark of play, but a light that tracked the world again. A fly landed on the edge of the cup and lifted away. He saw that, and his whiskers twitched. They could offer food later, a slurry of formula if he allowed touch, soft meat if he did not. For now, water would begin. The work food could not do. He closed his eyes for a count longer than a blink and opened them again. When he moved his paw, it did not shake. By full dusk, the yard had become part of the plain again, less a camp than a pause in the grass. He stayed near the posts with his body along their shadow, a small shape whose survival now depended on quiet math. Water in, heat out, breath steady enough to see morning. The rangers kept their vow of distance. When at last the manager let one more line fall into the soft dark, it sounded like a promise to the ground as much as to the animal. We wait. Night moved slow across the camp, the way cloth slides over a table, covering everything in quiet folds. The cub had not left the fence line, though the rangers had offered small comforts. Shade cloth fixed to a pole, water replaced when warm, drops left trailing down to damp the dust where his jaw rested. By morning the sun rose pale and thin, and with it came the stillness of a body that had survived the hours but had not gained strength. His breathing sounded heavier now, not the wheeze of thirst alone, but a labouring rhythm that made the chest lift too high, then pause too long. One ranger crouched nearby, keeping distance but studying the pattern of ribs beneath skin. What he saw did not fit the simple story of abandonment. The cub's side swelled more than hunger should allow, and when the light fell across his belly, the roundness was uneven, not the sag of fat, but a taut, unnatural curve. Each breath came with a faint shiver at the flanks. Flies landed and lifted, but he lacked the energy to flick them away. The ranger signaled quietly, and the camp manager stepped closer. They watched together, eyes narrowing until the manager murmured, "Parasites, maybe, or worse." The ranger nodded, his hand brushing dust from his knee, the gesture more thought than movement. He had seen cubs distended by worms, bellies full of air and misery. Yet something in the rhythm unsettled him. He leaned forward, not intruding, just listening to the sound of breath. The inhale dragged, the exhale caught, and beneath both, a faint tremor like the body carried something it could not share. By midday, the cub had not attempted to rise. The wildlife vet, waiting since the night before, finally gave the quiet order to move closer. The team prepared without noise. Gloves slipped on, gauze folded, saline bags hung on a pole. They knew it would not be easy. Touch was the final threshold. A body already surrendered to stillness could break under handling, but to leave him was worse. The ranger approached first, the one who had watched the longest. He crouched low, hand open, body turned, so he did not seem like a wall. The cub's ears flicked once, then fell still. His eyes opened, dull yellow under half-closed lids, and did not narrow. He allowed presence, if not trust. The ranger moved in, inch by inch, speaking in a voice barely above breath. "It's all right, little one." When the hand touched fur, it found heat without strength. The skin shifted too loosely over bone. The cub did not flinch, only closed his eyes. The ranger slid his arm beneath the chest, another beneath the haunch, and lifted carefully. He expected weightless hollowness, but what met his arms was heavier, strangely solid. The belly pressed outward, firm against his forearm. For a moment he thought only of swelling, of worms packed like cords inside. Then as he shifted the cub to settle him against his chest, he felt it. Movement. A small, sliding stir beneath the taut skin. He froze. The vet saw his eyes change. "What?" she whispered. The ranger shook his head, pressed his palm lightly against the belly, and waited. There, faint but certain, not the twitch of breath, not a spasm of pain, a second rhythm, a heart beating inside another. They laid the cub on the towel spread over grass. The vet knelt, placed her hand where his had been, closed her eyes. She waited through long seconds, breath held, until the tremor came again. She opened her eyes slowly. "Pregnant," she said, voice almost disbelief. "She's a female." Silence fell. For 2 days they had said he. They had read her hunger, her thinness, her silence, and had missed the greater truth. She carried life within her, even as her own life thinned. Now every decision carried 2 weights instead of 1. The vet worked quickly but softly, running her hand along the belly, noting firmness, swell, heat. The cub's breaths rattled beneath her ribs. She opened a pouch, drew out a small syringe of fluid, and injected beneath the skin at the shoulder. Subcutaneous hydration, safer than forcing a mouth too weak to swallow. The liquid formed a bubble beneath the skin, spreading coolness. The cub did not resist. She only breathed, slow and strained. The ranger kept his hand at her flank, feeling both rhythms, the mother's slowing heart and the faint flutter deeper inside. It was not steady. It came and went, irregular, like something uncertain of its right to continue. He swallowed hard and said only, "Hold on." The vet added iodine to the raw jaw wound, the smell sharp in the heat. She swabbed ticks from her ears, placed them in a vial. Each small act felt both urgent and inadequate, a patch on a dam already cracked. Yet the cub endured. Her chest rose, fell, hitched, continued. They lifted her again, slower this time, wrapped in the towel. She weighed almost nothing, yet her burden made her seem heavier than air should allow. Carried through the gate into the small treatment tent, she did not cry, did not struggle. Her head rested against the ranger's arm, eyes closed, mouth parted just enough to let the breath slip out. Inside, the light was dim. They set her down on a mat, away from noise, away from movement. The vet checked again, pulse weak, belly tight, lungs harsh. She spoke without drama, only fact. Severe malnutrition, possible late pregnancy, high risk. The ranger sat back on his heels and stared at the rise and fall of the small body, at the way her paw curled in toward her chest, as if she were holding something no one could see. The camp hushed. Even the guests, who had gathered at a respectful distance, seemed to sense the fragile turn of things. They said nothing. They watched the door of the treatment tent and listened to the low voices within. The fence, once boundary, had become threshold. Life hung between two worlds, the wild that had nearly abandoned her and the hands that now held her. Through the afternoon, the cub drifted in and out of shallow sleep. When she woke, her eyes moved slowly, scanning faces without fear, without hope, only awareness. She shifted her paws once, as if searching for a place to dig them in, and then stilled. The vet prepared a small dose of formula to rub against her lips, hoping instinct would do the rest. The cub licked once, twice, then turned her head. Her body was saving energy for something else. The ranger remained close, his hand still at her side. Each time the faint movement inside stirred, he felt it like a whisper. Fragile, improbable, demanding patience. He whispered back once, almost without meaning to, "Almost there." The sun fell low, filling the canvas with a muted orange glow. Outside, shadows stretched long across the dust. Inside, the cub lay in the dimness, belly rising and falling, carrying more than herself. The rangers exchanged glances but did not speak. Every choice from here would balance on the smallest margin. Life asked only for stillness, for waiting, for care without intrusion. As evening deepened, the faint flutter came again beneath the ranger's palm. It was weak, uncertain, but it was there. And for that moment, one heartbeat inside another, the tent held its breath, as if the whole plane leaned closer, listening. The drive to the vet station was measured in silence. A ranger held the lioness across his lap in the back of the vehicle, wrapped in a towel that carried the smell of dust and iodine. She did not struggle. Her paws hung limp, claws sheathed, and only the tremor of breath marked the distance between stillness and loss. Every few minutes, the ranger placed his palm against her belly to feel for what lay inside. Sometimes there was nothing. Then faintly, a flutter, irregular, hesitant, like the echo of a heart learning to beat. The station was little more than a low building with 2 rooms and soft light, powered by a generator that hummed gently in the corner. They carried her inside, laying her on a padded mat covered with clean cloths. A thin blanket was drawn over her narrow frame. Warmth, the vet said, would be her first medicine. It was not the kind of warmth she once knew from her mother's body or her siblings' press, but it was warmth enough to keep her own life from slipping further into the dark. Hours stretched long. Fluids were given slowly under the skin. Drops of milk formula brushed her lips, though most trickled away, absorbed by the cloth beneath her head. She licked weakly at the moisture, but made no effort to drink more. The vet noted the swelling of her belly, the tautness beneath, and spoke softly. "She's carrying late, we wait." Through the night, the station remained hushed. One ranger sat in the corner with a notebook, recording each breath as if cataloguing proof that she still belonged to this world. Another stepped in and out, checking the fuel that kept the small heater running. Shadows leaned across the floorboards, stretched by the lantern light, and shrank again as the wick was turned low. Just before dawn, the lioness stirred. Her body shifted in a slow wave, hindquarters trembling. A sound rose in her throat, not a roar, not even a cry, but a rough, broken moan. The vet knelt at her side, hand steady on her flank, and nodded once to the ranger. "It's starting." The first contraction arched her thin frame. She bore it without struggle, eyes half shut, breath grating through her throat. When it passed, she lay still, ribs fluttering. The rangers did not move closer. They waited, quiet, giving her the space her kind would normally find in the long grass. Minutes later, another contraction came, sharper, longer. She pressed her muzzle against the blanket and bit softly at the edge, teeth barely marking the fabric. When the first cub slid into the world, silence fell heavier than before. It was small, slack, its body unmoving. The vet worked quickly, clearing the mouth, rubbing briskly with a towel, but there was no answer. The lioness lifted her head, eyes dull, and nudged once. No movement followed. She lowered her muzzle again and turned away. The ranger bowed his head, saying nothing. Loss had become part of the plains rhythm, but here it was, too close, too fragile to name. The still cub was wrapped and set aside, not discarded but placed with care, as though even silence deserved respect. Minutes later, the lioness shuddered again. Her body tightened, hindquarters pushing against the mat. This time, the moan was longer, her jaw open, breath wheezing. The vet whispered, "Again, hold on." The ranger steadied her shoulders with a hand, not to restrain, but to remind her she was not alone. From beneath her tail came the second cub, smaller still, slick with fluid. At first, it too seemed stillborn, limbs loose, head heavy. The vet caught it in a towel, rubbing gently, listening with ear bent low. Then faintly the chest shifted. A tremor, a gasp like air breaking through water. "It's alive," the vet breathed, so soft it was nearly to herself. The ranger exhaled sharply as though he had been holding his lungs since the night before. The cub whimpered, thin, uncertain, the smallest sound of resistance. They laid it by the mother's flank, close to her heat. For a moment, she did not move, eyes closed, breath harsh. Then her muzzle lowered, tongue rasping once across the newborn's back. The gesture was brief, but it was everything: recognition, claim, and the faint spark of bond. The newborn shifted weakly under the touch, legs sliding, mouth opening in a blind search. Its cries were too faint to carry beyond the room, but inside the dim tent of warmth, the sound pressed into every chest. The rangers looked at each other, eyes lined with exhaustion, but none left their place. The vet guided the cub closer, placing it where instinct might lead it, to the nipple. The mother gave another tired lick, eyes half closed, and let the small body press against her belly. For a long time it did not succeed, mouth slipping against fur, but persistence lived in the tremor of its legs. The vet whispered, "Almost there," though she knew words carried no meaning here, only patience. The lioness, spent beyond measure, laid her head down. Her chest rose and fell, shallow. Yet her flank remained against the newborn. The warmth of her body became the cub's first shelter. One heartbeat lay beside another, fragile as morning frost. Outside, the horizon bled with the first pale stripe of dawn. Birds stirred in the branches, calling thin notes into the cool air. In the station, under dim light and the soft hum of the heater, the story of survival narrowed to this: a mother who had come to the fence with nothing left, and a cub whose life began in silence and shudder, then found a breath to hold. The stillborn sibling lay wrapped nearby, a silent twin whose presence gave weight to the one who lived. The rangers would bury it later beneath the tamarind tree near the station, where its short passage would not be forgotten. But for now, all eyes remained on the mother and the frail, trembling life she had licked into belonging. The ranger, who had first carried her, leaned forward, hand resting lightly against her back, careful not to intrude. He felt her ribs shift with breath, and beneath, the faint press of the living cub, searching still. He whispered, "You're not alone." In that quiet room, the plain's harsh edges seemed to fold away. For a few fragile hours, the only truth was warmth, breath, and the miracle of one cub alive against all odds. Weeks stretched into a season of slow repair. At the station, the mother lioness had been given time more than anything else, time to let fluids replace what drought and hunger had stolen, time for her body to mend enough to hold her head higher, time to watch her cub grow stronger by her side. Each morning, the rangers moved with deliberate quiet, checking wounds, refreshing water, laying meat in small strips so her stomach could manage what instinct urged her to devour. She never showed aggression, only a guarded distance, the kind born not of trust, but of sheer exhaustion. Her cub, though frail at birth, proved relentless. At first he trembled when he tried to crawl, his thin cries little more than whispers against the walls of the tent. But he pressed forward each day, finding the mother's belly with instinct that refused to fade. Soon his squeaks grew steadier, his paws pushing against the mat, small claws hooking clumsily into cloth. The rangers watched him with cautious relief, careful not to name hope too loudly. As the weeks passed, the lioness gained weight. Ribs that once cut sharply through her skin softened beneath new muscle. The wound along her jaw healed into a thin scar, fur growing over the rawness until only a faint line remained. Her eyes, once dulled to yellow haze, sharpened again, catching light, watching every shift of shadow outside the enclosure. When rangers approached with food, she did not run, but neither did she linger. She stood until the meat was placed, then waited for space to widen before stepping forward. The cub grew bolder in her wake. By the third week, he was climbing onto her shoulder, tumbling over her tail, testing his tiny roar against the air. The sound was soft, high-pitched, yet insistent enough to draw a faint, answering rumble from her chest. It was the only time the rangers saw her relax, her body loosening as she stretched out, letting him climb. He tugged her ear, and she endured it with the patience of one who had nearly lost him. The station could not hold them forever. Wildness does not remain where fences linger. The vet knew this, the rangers knew it, and perhaps even the lioness knew it in the way she began to pace. Pressing her paws against the corners of the enclosure, ears pricked toward the horizon as if listening for something only she could hear. The cub followed her, bounding clumsily, imitating the circles she traced. He was strong enough now, no longer the fragile breath held between life and death. He needed grass beneath his feet, dust in his lungs, the rhythm of the plain to carve his instincts sharper. On the appointed morning, the rangers loaded quietly. The vehicle was readied with care, not as a trap, but as a carriage of return. A crate was lined with straw and soft cloth, not to contain them long, only to ease the passage. The lioness entered without struggle, her cub pressed close against her side. She did not fight, though her eyes followed every latch and hand. The journey back was silent except for the steady hum of the engine and the occasional rustle of the cub shifting, seeking warmth against her flank. They drove to the reserve's edge, where the boundary met a long sweep of trees and grass that stretched unbroken into the distance. Here the air carried the musk of antelope, the faint track of zebra herds, the promise of wild things moving unseen. The rangers stopped the vehicle, cut the engine, and stepped out into the stillness. They lifted the crate gently to the ground and unlatched the door. For a moment, nothing happened. The lioness stayed inside, her golden eyes fixed on the line of trees. The cub shifted at her side, mewing softly, and she lowered her head to nudge him. Then slowly, she stepped forward. Dust rose beneath her paws. Her cub followed, blinking against the open light, his tiny body dwarfed by the horizon that waited. The rangers stood in silence, no one raising a hand, no one rushing the moment. Release was not theirs to grant. It belonged to her. She paused just beyond the crate, tail brushing the cub's flank, and turned her head once, not toward the trees, but back toward the camp they had left behind. The glance was fleeting, unreadable, yet heavy with something the rangers would carry long after she vanished from sight. The cub squeaked, tugging at her leg, and she moved again, guiding him into the shade of the tall grass. The ranger, who had first carried her weeks before, let out a long breath, his voice quiet enough to be mistaken for wind. She came to save one. The words were not meant for anyone in particular. They were meant for the plain itself, for the silent cub buried by the tamarind tree, and for the small life now walking beside her into wildness. The grass closed behind them. A faint flick of her tail was the last thing visible before even that was gone, absorbed into the weave of the reserve. The rangers stood for a while, unwilling to disturb the silence she left. Then slowly they turned back toward the vehicle. Evening drew across the sky as they drove away. Behind them, in the folds of grass and shadow, a mother and her cub pressed deeper into a world that had nearly taken them both. Ahead, the horizon burned with soft light, the day folding into dusk. The only sound was the hum of the tires and, carried faintly on the breeze, the rustle of trees making room for what had returned. The rangers did not speak again. They did not need to. The sight of her last glance, the cub at her side, and the knowledge that survival had claimed at least one life would remain longer than any words. In the hush of twilight, the wild reclaimed its own, and the camp carried only the memory, a scar in the earth, a whisper in the grass, and the soft truth of a mother who had come to the fence and left with her cub alive.